Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Athena's and Monnet Meet the Researcher series. The main aim of the Athena's and Monnet is to focus on the multiple security crises and more specifically the EU's role as a global actor. Some of the questions we're trying to respond to with our work in the series: how can the EU become a more effective global actor and also contribute to peace and security? My name is Dr. Dimitris Bouris, and I'm the chairholder of this chair. And I would also want to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Dr. Olga Burliuk, who is senior researcher in the chair. And we are trying to address these questions through interdisciplinary research, but also research-based activities and courses which complement our teaching, our own research, but also include different dissemination activities. The idea of this series, of Meet the Researcher series, is for our own students, but also for everyone who will eventually be watching this video, to have the opportunity to get insights from well-established colleagues researching different aspects of the European Union's role as a global actor, how they conduct their own research, what kind of approaches they use for their own research, what kind of case studies, and also what kind of questions guide their own research. So we hope that with these webinars, we will also inspire our own students to think and reflect on their own positionality, on their own research methods. And I'm really happy to have a very good colleague, but also a very good friend with us today, Dr. Hanna Muehlenhoff, who is a senior lecturer in European Studies with a focus on Europe in the world at the Department of European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Hanna has worked as a lecturer at the Department of the European Studies between 2018 and 2020. She also worked as a lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at VU. And she has also held a postdoctoral position at the Amsterdam Center for Contemporary European Studies between 2016 and 2017. She did her PhD at the University of Tübingen, where she defended it in 2015. And a lot of people will know Hanna from her work, which focuses on issues of security, militarism, civil society funding, and activism in Europe, including the European Union, Turkey, Georgia, and the Netherlands. She's engaging with feminist, queer, post-colonial, and Foucauldian perspectives. And she's working in this context, she's also working on feminist foreign policies, such as in the European Union, the Netherlands, and Germany. Between July 2022 and July 2024, she was elected co-chair of the Council of European Studies, Gender and Sexuality Research Network, and currently she's a diversity advocate at the Capacity Group of European Studies at the UVA. She has published a lot throughout the years, and we will come back to discussing some of this work. More recently, she co-edited a special issue on gender, race, and coloniality in European security policies for European Security Journal. She has a monograph on the EU and democracy promotion and governmentality, Turkey and beyond, which was published by Routledge in March 2019. And the monograph shows how neoliberal rationalities of EU funding depoliticized human rights organizations in Turkey. And it specifically focuses on the agency of Turkish women's LGBTQ and human rights organizations working with different EU grants. There are a lot more publications, but instead of me going through them, I have prepared some questions for each of them. And I would like to thank you, Hanna, a lot for being with us today and doing this Meet the Researcher series. And I guess what I would like to do first is to take you back to your PhD years. I know it's been a while. And the first kind of question would be, what led you to decide to pursue a PhD in the first place? Because we have students here, we have people who will be watching this video, and a lot of them might be thinking about doing a PhD. Um, so what led you decide to pursue a PhD? What was your PhD about? And what made you research this particular topic, but also what kind of research methods did you use?
Hi. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you, Dimitris, and to meet you all virtually. I think I can see everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Yeah. So I was thinking a little bit about like some of the my past work before, and it's what like I was thinking that on the one hand it feels like yesterday, on the other hand also I hardly remember things I did. So it's also, I think, as a bit of a disclaimer, a little bit of a post-rationalization when we talk about these things. Or on the one hand, like we're trying to make sense of our own biography, that's sometimes also, yeah, just shaped by lots of coincidences, I think. But to your first question, why did I do a PhD, or how did that come about? Um, yeah, well, I studied a bachelor in political science in Germany, and then I did actually European studies at the University of Amsterdam, finally where I work now, which was never really the plan, but also another coincidence. Um, and the yeah, during actually my MA, it was to me quite clear that I was interested, or I was always interested very much in the EU, and in particular in EU and external relations, so it's international politics. And having grown up in Germany, I was especially kind of annoyed actually by debates in Germany around Turkey's EU membership, because it was, well, at that time very politicized. It was on the agenda, but it was also very much shaped by kind of um, yeah, a lot of kind of ways that the German politics were already approaching kind of the questions around integration of Turkish German migrants, etc. Or I mean, labor migrants, Turkish Germans in Germany, I should say. So the debate in Germany was very much, I think, yeah, politicized in these ways, and there was a lot of kind of opposition to Turkey's EU membership, and I was quite annoyed with that actually. So I was very interested in the case of Turkey in terms of EU-Turkey relations, and at that time, um, it was also more on the political agenda than it is nowadays. So this is why I started in my MA thesis writing about EU-Turkey relations, and yeah, then I wanted to go to Turkey because I hadn't been to Turkey and wanted to get to know Turkey a little bit. So then I did an internship in Turkey, in like a more of like a think tank, work on EU-Turkey relations. And that I did a bit of like kind of research there, and there I kind of developed this idea that I really wanted to write more about this. So for me, it didn't really start with like I wanted to do a PhD. It started more with I want to write more about this topic, and I want to get to know Turkey better, and I want to get to know especially Turkish civil society better. And I would like to also present maybe a different image of Turkey in some sort of way. So that was very much my motivation, actually, and for continuing kind of studying in that sense. I didn't really feel like I was done after my MA. So I really looked also then specifically to like for opportunities to work on these topics. I mean, yeah, there's different ways you can also, look more for PhD opportunities within given like research projects where you have to do kind of work on a specific topic. But I mean, I think this would have also been a good choice, but at that point I was very set on my idea. It changed over time, of course, but I started really from, well, this is really what I want to write more about. And yeah, this is then how I tried looking for PhD opportunities and funding. And it was not that easy. In the end, I went back to Germany because I found kind of a supervisor who also was interested in working on EU-Turkey relations and also interested in this more critical approach to the topic. Yeah. You ask about methods?
Yes. What
Yeah.
kind of methods did you use for your PhD?
For my PhD, I work with mainly two things. So on one hand, discourse analysis. I analyzed a lot of first EU policy documents regarding human rights promotion abroad, and in particular Turkey. And I also analyzed documents of civil society organizations in Turkey through discourse analysis. And then I also conducted interviews, which were in a sense the most important thing for the my main analysis. So I conducted interviews in Turkey with representatives of civil society organizations, women's LGBTQI and Kurdish rights organizations, and also actually refugee rights organizations, which are then also analyzed in a sense through a kind of discourse analytical lens. But yeah, so that the interviews were really the most important source for me.
Thank you. One of your first publications, I guess in the framework of the PhD, was an article in Cooperation and Conflict in 2016 entitled Ambiguities of Power, Struggle and Resistance in the Relations between Turkey and the European Union. Could you please talk to us a little bit more about this article, the central aim of the article? Because from what I understand, you use the Foucauldian lens for this particular article. So if you could talk to us a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So here, similar bit to my PhD, my point of departure was that I found that some of the representation of Turkey relations were a little simplistic in a sense, and looking especially at the literature on academic literature on EU-Turkey relations, we had on the one hand kind of the literature that understood more EU-Turkey relations in this very top-down way. So, questions of, is the Turkey adopting the acquis communautaire? And then we had a little bit of new development in the Europeanization literature that did look also at domestic actors more and more, that said, well, there's also domestic actors and they need to adopt it or they might resist it and so and so. But what I think was not really done, or what there was a lack of focus or understanding of, that the power relations between EU and Turkey were actually more complex, in the sense that it wasn't, because even in the Europeanization literature that did take into account domestic actors, they did start always from the EU as a vantage point. So power always kind of rests with the EU, and then maybe there's domestic actors that kind of push a bit back, or like they are obstructing it or so. But it still was very much resting with the EU. And then it was also seen a little bit in this like black box of EU-Turk relations if there's nothing like bigger, more global developments happening. And so the point of this Foucauldian approach was to understand power in more multi-directional ways, and in more kind of productive ways. And I try to, in this analysis, show also that in some ways, sometimes some developments that were actually somehow criticized by the EU were also kind of started by the use of, very much had to do with neoliberal restructuring, for instance, from which actually the the party and government, Erdogan's party, benefited a lot and could like place more emphasis on Islamic civil society organizations filling in, and there's actually like a much more complex context in which EU-Turkey relations are happening, in which we don't only have local actors pushing back, but we have really kind of more complex relationships that also go beyond actually the EU and Turkey, and they had to do with more global transformations as well at that point. So that was my kind of the idea for this article.
So was it a kind of frustration, let's say, with mainstream EU study literature?
Yeah, it sounds like I'm bitter, but I do work a lot on frustration. Or with like why, a feeling of there's something missing, or there's not it's more maybe complicated, and also something that maybe does go through my work. Like, let's look a little bit also at the other side of this relationship, and see it also more as a relationship and less as kind of a top-down situation.
Thank you. In the next couple of years, you continued focusing and utilizing Foucauldian notions and perspectives, but you kind of shifted to issues related to democracy promotion, LGBT rights. What led to this shift?
I don't know whether there was so much a shift. So a lot of things I think did come a bit out of my PhD and different aspects there. So in the PhD, I looked at how EU democracy promotion, and here I really just mean human rights support, funding for human rights organizations. So I think democracy promotion, can mean all kinds of things, but that's more really the big umbrella term. How that impacted civil society organizations in Turkey. And the cases I looked at in Turkey in terms of civil society organizations were women's rights organizations and LGBTQI rights organizations, Kurdish rights organizations, and refugee rights organizations. And what in a sense, there was already quite a lot written on women's rights organizations, and also on Kurdish rights, and that was also a bit more difficult because Kurdish rights were often, there weren't really Kurdish rights organizations, but more human rights organizations, so it was a bit more difficult to define that kind of field. And refugee rights was quite different again, but LGBTQI rights were somehow the most interesting case to me in this context, because there was so much transformation happening during those times, and there was actually a lot of more recognition. And I mean, we had pushback against LGBTQI rights in Turkey again, but during that time I was studying it, they became so much more visible. Around 2012, 10, 13, and then the Gezi Park protests, which also made it very visible. So this is why I, in the end, kind of decided to take that case and write like kind of an extra piece on that case, so to say. And I think that's how I kind of then went down further, being interested in more queer approaches to the EU, and more looking at questions of LGBTQI rights and EU external policies. But you're right. I always kind of I kept a bit my Foucauldian lens from my PhD years. I tried to sometimes get rid of it, but somehow it often creeped back in. So it does shape you, I think, quite a bit what you're doing in your PhD, because you work on it for a long time. So it does shape your thinking. And I often feel like, oh, you look at something and you're like, oh, you have again the same kind of lens you had before. So yeah, but I've moved a bit away from it now.
Okay. I want to bring you to your monograph, which was published in 2019 by Routledge, which focused on EU democracy promotion, governmentality, and EU-Turkey relations. Could you please talk to us a little bit more about this book?
Yeah, so this book basically came out of my PhD, and it's I mean, it's reworked a bit. And so the kind of main point of the book, or the main argument, is it's again has to do with also Foucauldian understanding um, of power. So there, I was inspired by work that looked at EU democracy promotion or EU human rights funding as a form of neoliberal governmentality, and that then criticized how basically neoliberal rationalities that we have in EU funding instruments, how they depoliticize civil society organizations. So you've probably heard maybe the term NGOization, which is also kind of similar in terms of its, diagnosis of kind of how civil society changes with international funding. So yeah, kind of this professionalization, focusing more on projects and lots of management, less political work. So these are kind of the claims that like critical literature on civil society funding has made. And so I kind of took as a starting point, because I was very much interested in, is the EU really helping civil society in Turkey? And is this claim that it's, the very critical claim, is it just depoliticizing them? Does that make any sense? And I was kind of starting by saying, well, this critique of this depoliticization of civil society is also very much critique that was developed within kind of the Western context of like the Western welfare state, and a very specific history also of civil society and also social services. So I was kind of making the point that maybe this looks a bit different in a different context, in a different historical context as well. So my question was basically, is this funding depoliticizing civil society in Turkey? And also here the idea was to take their agency very much seriously, and to really, hear how does civil society work with EU funding? What do they think about EU funding? And I mean, generally what I found is that they're of course all quite aware of these rationalities, and that they are trying to also partly resist them and work with them, etc. So yeah, in the book, I kind of use a Foucauldian as well as also a neo-Gramscian lens to understand how specific I here differentiate between liberal and neoliberal rationalities kind of interact in like a kind of domestic political context. And unsurprisingly, the result is that it is partly depoliticizing, but it can also be politicizing if the context is very much kind of highly securitized, so to say, or highly politicized. So, for instance, LGBTQI rights were very much, securitized earlier, but was kind of, aligning itself with the EU and kind of more neutral, more technical, rights-based politics. It actually for a while um, made it possible for the organizations to put LGBTQ rights on the agenda. But now the context has changed again, and like a reference to, for instance, the EU, etc., is not really as powerful any longer as it was back then.
In 2020, you moved, I mean, I guess it was a natural move, or maybe not, but you moved to focusing more specifically on issues related to gender equality, to masculinities, and EU foreign and security policy. What led you to start of kind of doing this research, or was it just a continuation of things you were doing and then an effort to further analyze them using different perspectives?
Yeah. I think it was, for me, it did feel a little bit like a turn, even though I do think there are some continuities. I, you know, think after when you're done with your PhD, you also feel like maybe you need to venture to different directions a little bit. But I had started reading a little bit of feminist literature during my PhD, even though I didn't really use it in my PhD. I'd never encountered feminist theory in my studies. I hope this is different today. But I don't think in my IR class we had Marxism, and I think that and social constructivism. I think that was the extent of critical theory. So my one of my supervisors at the time, actually, she suggested, oh, maybe you should look a bit into like feminist literature. And I didn't use it very much for my PhD, but I did like, yeah, like I started reading it a lot. I also started teaching it myself, actually. So then became more familiar with it. Um, and I was still following EU foreign policy. So in the feminist literature is very much on security when it comes to international relations. And I think there I thought, okay, so there's a lot of feminist literature on security, but there's not really anything on the EU. And the EU security literature was, yeah, very, you might say, mainstream again, but was, very focused on is there integration? It's too intergovernmental. I mean, it was in a sense it was a bit normative because it was always critiquing the EU for not being enough of a security actor. I mean, we see, of course, similar debates right now. But so I was really like, okay, but what is the EU doing in terms of thinking about gendered consequences of its security policy? And this is and I didn't see that there had been much work done. I think yeah, you already had Roberta Guerrina, she and some of her colleagues, they had started with working on this. And yeah, so that's then I just kind of tried out to think about EU security in these terms. And the EU had started implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda of the United Nations. So that was a bit my entry point to thinking about gender in EU security policies.
Thank you. And 2 years later, you also started including issues of race in your own research. Was this again a kind of continuation from the feminist thought or the feminist research or research on gender, or was it something new? Why did you decide to look at other aspects as well?
I think this came very much out of kind of just conversations that we had amongst kind of colleagues that were working on EU foreign policy from feminist perspectives. So yeah, I think we always said, well, feminist perspectives already emphasize intersectionality, which means also including other categories of discrimination, such as race, but also class, ability, etc. I mean, you can debate what all to include and when, but so I think there was often lip service paid in also our work saying, well, it should be an intersectional approach, but we didn't maybe take it, or I didn't really take it any further, so to say. The entry point or the main focus was still gender. And at the same time, I think was around also in the 2020 and the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and also discussions at our own universities and also in my department around decolonizing European studies, where I think it became more and more obvious to us that we have to think about coloniality when we think about the EU. So somehow it seemed more like, why didn't we take this more seriously before? And there was also more and more work in this area produced around the EU, maybe more in the context of, for instance, migration border policies, where it's very obvious, of course, how coloniality and race plays a role. But yeah, so I mean, I've been working a lot together with other colleagues, in particular, as you know, with Massimo Reinholting, Natalie Belfens, and we were at several conferences where we discussed work, and it more and more shifted these discussions to, okay, how can we really think about race and coloniality in EU security policies?
Actually, this was my next question, because in 2023 you co-edited the special issue in European Security Journal with Maren Hoijnik and Natalie Belfens, and the title was "Who's in Security? Gender, Race, and Coloniality in European Security Policies. And you gave us already the background of what led to this, but could you talk to us a little bit more about the special issue itself?
Yes, I suggest a little bit hint that this came out of this collaboration with two colleagues and friends, and we had basically had a lot of panels and discussions at conference and workshops where we had kind of met up with other scholars working on similar issues, and we thought at some point, okay, why don't we try to publish something together? There's already all this work there, and the idea with this special issue was to a little bit advance the debate further. I mean, as I said, there was already people doing this work, and especially around migration and border policies. Um, but we thought maybe with a special issue we could make it more visible in European security policies. And so there was this kind of general also discussions around thinking about coloniality. And also we thought it was an important moment because we had these developments in EU security and defense policy where it was more and more push towards more military capacities, more emphasis on military means. And at the same time, we also had Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which also pushed debates around security in the EU, but also debates within academia around questions of what does coloniality mean, whose knowledge are we listening to, etc. So in a sense, this was kind of the incentive for the special issue, and the special issue. We have we didn't provide like a clear framework, but the kind of commonality is that all the papers work with either feminist and or post-colonial approach. Many kind of combine this, and they try to understand the gendered or racialized either kind of consequences of EU policies or also how EU policies are constituted by ideas of gender and race. But a lot of the work also, and that was kind of important to us, moves a bit away from the EU as the center, which brings me actually a bit back to also what my motivation was also in the beginning, but like really looks more at places that we often consider to be the periphery of Europe, and the EU is more in the background in these analysis, but we do see that it plays into discourses and practices within these contexts that have to do with security, such as around migration, for instance, or also around gender within the war in Ukraine and debates also within Ukraine. So our point was also a bit like to move away from this like EU focus only on the EU and this top-down idea, but also move to other places. So there's quite a like range of different kind of contributions in the special issue.
And I would really want to encourage students, but also future viewers of this video to have a look at this special issue, not just because I'm a co-editor of this journal and I'm happy that this special issue was published in our journal, but also because I think there are so many different cases which are covered in the special issue. So I'm sure that people will find a lot of the papers of interest. Hanna, when it comes to research methods that you use for your own research, you already told us that you have used interviews as a research method, discourse analysis. Have you or do you use any other methods? And how stuck are you as a researcher into one method, or not? Do you get inspiration while you read or while you do your own research? Do you try new research methods, or do you stick to the ones that feel more kind of comfortable?
I would like to say I try new research methods, but I'm not sure it's true. I do think I still work very much with variations of discourse analysis and interviews. I would like to do, I mean, interviews are field work to some extent, but if yeah, it's not as in depth often as it could be. I would like to actually be able to do a bit more really yeah, ethnographic field work or really being in places for longer periods of time than we often can. And yeah, be do more kind of participatory observation in that sense. I did play once with the idea to do more participatory action research where you really work together with, for instance, in my case, would probably be civil society organizations and think about, you know, they play kind of an equal role in thinking about the research and creating something new. Um, that seemed very interesting to me, but I never got the funding to do that. So then I didn't pursue that any further. But yeah, I very much still work with analyzing discourse. There, of course, there's different methods, right? You can do more of a critical discourse analysis, um, or more of an intertextual discourse analysis. But I'm not so, yeah, I don't do rigid linguistics analysis or anything like that. That's not really my thing. Also doesn't necessarily serve kind of for the what I'm interested, yeah, or you know, that it doesn't really help me finding out what I'm interested in. I think a lot of challenge often lies in the fact that I try sometimes to study things that are very invisible. So, for instance, also we together try to look for sexuality in EU security policies, and while I think, at least I would say there, it's sometimes very hard to show because it's more implied. That's generally kind of the challenge for feminist work and as well as also queer work, uh, even I think for post-colonial work, that sometimes things are not that explicit. And there I think it helps to work with the idea of intertextuality, so thinking about what might these ideas in the text, what other texts might they refer to, and what's kind of the bigger context, and what's kind of plausible in terms of um, what's assumed in these texts.
And what are your current short-term and longer-term research projects? What I know that you are just coming back.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what
just
is
coming
the
out of leave.
pipeline?
Just coming out of leave, so I'm kind of trying to refine my research. But I would say, so on the one hand, I currently I'm still following and working a bit on feminist foreign policy, especially together with two colleagues also at the University, Lucy Hall and Lara Talsma. We are trying to yeah, work with civil society in the Netherlands that were very much involved in discussions around feminist foreign policy to see how we can support them in the current also political context. There was a big hype for feminist foreign policies in the past 5 years, but I think we might be seeing the end of that, considering, I mean, the current government in the Netherlands has not taken up the feminist foreign policy, and in Germany, where they have also the past government installed a feminist foreign policy, that might also be in question. So we'll see what happens there. But this is something still and critically also following and studying, and here trying to work a bit more together with civil society. And otherwise, I'm trying to put into words research I did before my leave last year in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I interviewed peace organizations, especially feminist peace organizations, around questions of militarism and security. And here I followed a bit my also the debate that has taken place since the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine started, around questions of yeah, whose voices are kind of central and trying to listen to civil society activists in context where there is strong polarization, for instance, between pro EU and pro Russia positions, and where it's difficult to also kind of find some sort of something in between, and how they also deal with kind of the existing situation of also of a security threat, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to rethink a bit my critique of militarism through this work.
Hanna, last question, since you touched upon it, and I mean, you mentioned that while you were doing your masters, and I can say while I was doing my masters as well, like in the IR courses, we would never be taught feminist or queer literature, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of changed in the last 5 years, roughly, when we started taking more into consideration the idea of intersectionality, the idea of, looking at other things which have been invisible or people hadn't touched upon them. And what we see today is this current political climate in Europe, in the US, where we have, a kind of political rhetoric, which is against any kind of diversity. And this political rhetoric, which goes against, issues related to gender, to race, to sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And I would like to ask you how you see the current political developments. In a sense, do you think that what is happening politically might affect your own research, or the ways you do your research, or the topics you research, if all this continues? Or do you see your research as a way of resisting, let's say, to what is happening politically?
Yeah, this is, I think, also question that's on my mind, and also kind of feel like coming back to work at the university in this current kind of political context has been also a bit challenging in this regard. I do see my research as some small way of resisting some of these developments. I think there's this, like, on the one hand, it feels a bit like pointless sometimes. Because you're also wondering, like, who cares? But apparently they do care, because otherwise academia wouldn't get attacked this much in this current moment. So I do see it as a small act of resistance to the current developments of kind of rise of fascism and right-wing thinking in Europe, and obviously in the US. But I'm also worried about it, because on the one hand, I think I used to think, or maybe, I don't know, I used to maybe think I don't have an issue there in this context. I don't have to think about or be concerned about my own kind of place as a researcher and doing this kind of research. But this, I think, has changed for me as well, and I think for many of us, because we do see how quickly the mood can change, and how quickly we can become a target. And together also generally with cuts in academia, but also very much targeting of anyone working on questions of gender, sexuality, and race. I do think we need to be aware that this might be on the horizon, but hopefully, we can put up some fight and resistance, and not change our research according to the kind of political agenda.
Hopefully we can, and we should actually, not just hope that we can, but I think we have an obligation to. Very last question. Students here in this class, but also everyone who will be watching this video in the future, they are crafting their own research proposal. They will be writing their own theses. You are a very well-established supervisor as well, so you are also doing this kind of work. And my last question would be, what kind of advice would you give to these master students in terms of topics, methods, broader advice, whatever you prefer?
I can only speak from my own kind of vantage point, and as I already said in the beginning, I mean, I always work on things that I feel like often frustrated, but also generally passionate about, to put it more positively. So I think if you think about like what you're writing your thesis about, you should, think about something, that you should ask yourself, okay, what is it I want to say here? Of course, you're going to do an analysis and you're going to maybe find out things are differently than you think, but I do think you should start with a bit of like a drive in this way of like, this is really, or this is important to me. And this is why I want to work on this, and have a little bit of an idea of maybe also, what you want to say with your work. At the same time, I think then thinking about methods, it's of course the thesis is also, you have limited time, etc. You can be pragmatic. I think looking at, what is actually there, what can I actually study. So I mean, I always kind of advise my students to do a little bit of research, in terms of what kind of empirical material is there, before committing kind of a whole research plan, to see what is actually feasible to do and which methods make sense. So I think, yeah, for me, this is kind of the combination of what is really relevant to me, and then how can I really put this into practice? What is actually there for me to work with? And you can't say everything in in one thesis. So it's if you want to say more, consider a PhD, but it is always important to also really then focus on what you want to say, and not to try to maybe say everything that's possible, or what you feel like has to all be said. But
Thank
yeah, I
you.
think everyone works in a different way.
Thank you. I'm keeping the combination of passion and frustration. I like this kind of combination. I'll open up for some questions from the class. Are there any questions, comments, whatever you want to? Yeah.
At the beginning, Boris said that some of us want to pursue a PhD, which is good, but I'm not really one of those, but it's something I think about. So how would you like convince someone who is in doubt pursuing a PhD to do so?
I mean, I don't know whether I'm in the business of trying to convince anyone to do a PhD, because it's also not the, let's say, the not the easiest path in terms of job market, and it's unfortunately not getting easier currently. But I think, it's a question of whether you feel like you would want to dive more deeply into a research topic. I think that can be one motivation, as that was more my motivation. I think you can also have the motivation that you would like to work at the university. Maybe, if you like the idea of teaching and doing research, then that could be another motivation to do a PhD, and maybe there you are more open in terms of also joining existing research projects, which gives you more chances in terms of applying for PhD funding. I mean, I know also people that were working first somewhere else, and then over time during their work realized that they still want to do a PhD, so they weren't so sure maybe when they were done with their MA, and then did something else for a while, and then realized, okay, this is still somehow in my head and I would like to do this, which can, I think, be very good also, because then you have some practice experience, and you might be able to draw from that, and that can also be a good path. to a PhD.
Were you always sure that you wanted to pursue this path, or just kind of rolled into it?
No, I wasn't always sure. I thought I would maybe rather work kind of behind the scenes in politics, not as not be a politician myself, but I thought more, I don't know, European Parliament in the background. This is kind of the internships I did, German Parliament or European Commission. This was more what I originally thought I was gonna do. At the same time, I also had a bit of, I also wrote for newspapers as freelancers for quite a while. So this was a bit my second path, although I thought journalism is even more tricky than academia, so I wasn't sure I was going to do that. But yeah, no, as I said, it really developed a bit with my interest in Turkey, and also not finding it that easy to find a job actually after my studies. And then I started thinking more about PhD and kind of started only working on that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm going to try and talk loudly.
Can you hear Linda?
Yes, I can hear her.
Oh, perfect.
What kind of like moral or like ethical considerations do you have of like researching as a Western white scholar in like critical discourses? And also I was wondering, what was it like back when you had your PhD, like working with civil societies? What were your considerations and how did that change throughout your career, like taking your own positionality into consideration?
Yeah, that's a very good, important question. And I think during my PhD, there was not so much reflection on this, at least like not in a more professional context. But it's of course a very relevant question. It was of course relevant as like a German person, white German person coming into Turkey. I did speak some Turkish and I could read Turkish, but I did still do also interviews in English because my Turkish wasn't good enough for that. So I did think about that doing that research. At that time, people were very happy to talk to me, but of course, I came also a bit, from the EU side, that there was a lot of aspiration to join the EU. So if you think about that, there was probably an imbalance there in that sense already back then. Moving on, like now working more on questions of post-coloniality and also with like my co-authors for the special issue, we thought a lot about this, whether we actually were all like white scholars in Western European institutions can really publish this special issue or edit this special issue. We only wrote the introduction of the special issue. And we also talked about this like with the other authors and contributors. And yeah, I think you can have different ideas about this, but our idea is we are trying to work together, and we are trying to also kind of push this work, and also trying to take a step back, making space for others to as well. So I mean, it's also, you can't just place the responsibility on certain colleagues to do this work. I think everyone needs to kind of step in here. And in terms of my relationship also to civil society and civil society activists, there is one thing, if you're a feminist researcher, there's often a bit of a feeling of we are quite similar when you do research with feminist activists. So we have, maybe there's an idea of we have similar goals or we have similar ideas. And there's actually also a lot of kind of moving between feminist civil society, even also policymakers that work on gender issues and academia. So this is there's actually interesting work written on this. Is called Feminist Critical Friends, that kind of thinks about this relationship between feminist researchers and the people they speak to, so policymakers and activists. So there is a bit of this feeling of like we are in a more equal power relationship, or we are quite equal, but of course that's not always true. So there is also different ideas, and there is also different kind of resources and power, etc. So I think that's important to also to consider in this context. And I felt also very kind of aware of that when I did my interviews in Tbilisi. There was generally also actually a lot of willingness to talk to me, also because there's not much research that's been done there, and there hasn't been much interest there. But that's also, again, of course, then this bit unequal relationship.
Thank you, Hanna. Any other questions?
Can I maybe add something to that?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's important, of course, then you take extra care when you do this kind of work. So you really make sure that that you explain what you're doing, and that you also always double check everything, and that you're very transparent about what you're doing, and that you also try. I mean, in a feminist sense, you have the idea is that you're doing work that helps people that are marginalized, and that supports kind of their needs, and it's not going to be kind of harmful in any way, of course. So that's kind of the ethics always behind kind of the work, thinking about how can I contribute to like increasing or to improving the situation, and also a bit what kind of knowledge do they need, maybe what can I do for them in a way, which doesn't mean you're not you lose all critical distance, but it's still the important thing is that you're not doing any harm, but that you're trying to reduce harm.
Yes.
Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, I know it might be a bit of an abstract question compared to the rest, but my question was more towards since you like approached the EU from a critical discourse point, and we look into the EU from like critical lenses into its functions in terms of external actions. How do you remain hopeful with current political events in the European Union? And how do you like put that into your research? And yes, just
Wait, what's the last question?
how do you hopeful into like what you do compared to the current European political situation? And like how do you as scholar, but like us as students as well, should like what is your advice to keep on pushing, although maybe certain events could be discouraging us from seeing any hopeful perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good, important question. Actually, question I also discussed a bit with my colleagues, because we were, also thinking, okay, we need to somehow avoid that we're just like, I don't know, coming out of our classroom and everyone is just depressed. And I do think currently maybe the news it's been like, I think we've been saying this for years, but okay, but it just seems to be getting worse. But it is sometimes hard to stay hopeful. And I think for my strategy to stay hopeful is to focus on alternatives. And that's also why I'm more interested. I mean, I do also look at the youth policy, and I try to kind of analyze the discourses and to deconstruct it. And but I also always move again to civil society, because this is where I hope to see, and usually you find alternative ideas for the future, and you see cooperation and you see care for each other, and you see also joy even in like situations of situations of a lot of like oppression even, and in situations where it seems maybe hopeless, and that's at least what I've always seen. That there was in Turkey, in Georgia. I've done also work with civil society in the Netherlands. that's where I look for kind of hope to emphasize alternatives. And I think also actually that's important also for us in the classroom to think about how else could it be? Because I think sometimes because the discourse is so strong, and there is this a feeling of, well, but there's no alternatives to any of this. This is of course, often how political discourse works, to present things as no alternative in some shape or form. So to think about, could it be different? How could it be different? And feminists are often kind of, blamed for being too idealistic, or that's like, naive or so, but they've been fighting a lot this idea, saying, well, it's not naive to think about a better world. It's not naive to think about, politics as relationships, etc. But yeah, so that's how I remain hopeful. And I think that's actually why I started turning towards especially also feminist literature, because there's also hope and joy in that.
Thank you, Hanna. Any last questions? No. No. No more questions for you. A big thank you for your time and for your willingness to do this. And also thank you even more because I know that you're almost just back to work. So I know that it's been probably quite hectic catching up with everything. So we appreciate a lot your time, and a lot of the students of this class read your work as well for today. Quite a few of the articles you have written, and they already draw inspiration from them for their own thesis. But I hope that this will be helpful and interesting for the rest of the people who will be watching this video after it's uploaded on YouTube. Let's close with a hopeful message of resistance and combining passion with frustration. I think this is one way to move forward. And once again, thanks a lot, Hanna, for being with us.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for your question.